Margaret Atwood Jenkins stepped into the Lexington Grand Hotel, pulling her small suitcase behind her. She had been traveling for hours. Her knees ached, her lower back throbbed, and all she wanted was to check in, kick off her shoes, and sink into a comfortable bed. The lobby was as grand as she remembered from the website. High ceilings, crystal chandeliers, marble floors polished to perfection. A faint scent of fresh lilies lingered in the air. But despite the beauty of the place, she felt a hint of discomfort. It wasn't the hotel itself. It was the way eyes lingered on her as she walked toward the front desk. Margaret was used to it. A lifetime of being the only black woman in certain spaces had taught her to recognize subtle shifts in body language, small hesitations, forced politeness. She ignored the curious glances and approached the desk, offering the young receptionist a small, tired smile. "Good evening. I have a reservation under Margaret Atwood Jenkins," she said, placing her confirmation number on the counter. The receptionist barely had time to glance at the screen before a sharp voice interrupted. "That won't be necessary, Jasmine." Margaret turned toward the source. A tall, middle-aged woman with sleek blonde hair and an expression carved from stone stood a few feet away, arms crossed over her chest. Her eyes swept over Margaret, and just like that, she dismissed her. "I'm sorry, ma'am." The woman, her gold nameplate read Deborah Lancaster, hotel manager, said, her tone clipped and impatient. "We're fully booked." Margaret blinked, surprised. "That's impossible. I made my reservation weeks ago, paid in advance." Deborah sighed, like she had already decided this conversation wasn't worth her time. "There must have been an error. We don't have a room for you." Margaret didn't move. She had spent decades leading classrooms, breaking up fights between teenagers, handling difficult parents. She knew when someone was lying to her. "Then check again," she said, her voice firm but calm. The younger receptionist hesitated, fingers hovering over the keyboard, but Deborah gave her a quick, cutting look, a warning. The receptionist swallowed hard and stepped back. Margaret exhaled slowly. She wasn't about to let this woman dismiss her like some unimportant inconvenience. "I have an email confirmation," she said, reaching into her purse. "If there was an issue, I should have been informed before I arrived." Deborah's mouth twitched in annoyance. "Listen," she said, lowering her voice as if she was doing Margaret a favor. "This is an exclusive hotel. Maybe there was a miscommunication about the standards we maintain here." There it was. Margaret's hands curled into fists at her sides, but she kept her face neutral. "The standard you claim to uphold is honoring reservations. So, unless there's another reason you're refusing me service, I suggest you check again." For a brief second, a flicker of hesitation crossed Deborah's face, but was gone just as quickly. She let out a mocking laugh, shaking her head. "I don't have time for this." She waved toward security, a tall man standing near the entrance. "I need this woman removed." Margaret's breath caught. "Excuse me," Deborah repeated, her voice louder now. "Leave. Now, you're causing a disturbance." The security guard was already walking over. Other guests had started glancing toward the scene. Some looked away quickly, uninterested. Others stared with barely concealed curiosity. Margaret felt her chest tighten. She wasn't a threat. She wasn't shouting, breaking rules, or causing any problems. She was an elderly woman who had paid for a room at a hotel she could afford. And yet, here she was, treated like a criminal. But Margaret wasn't done yet. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. But before she could press a single button, the security guard stopped in front of her, blocking her path. Margaret tightened her grip on her phone, her heart pounding with a mix of disbelief and quiet fury. The security guard, a broad-shouldered man with a blank expression, positioned himself between her and the front desk, as if she were an actual threat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady but firm, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Margaret met his eyes, searching for some trace of hesitation, some sign that he saw this for what it was. But he didn't flinch. He had a job to do, and it didn't seem to include questioning orders. "I'm not leaving without speaking to someone higher than her," Margaret said, nodding toward Deborah. "I have a right to be here." Deborah let out a short, exasperated laugh. "Higher than me? I am the manager," she said, tilting her head. her smirk widening. You think calling someone else will change anything? The hotel is full. There's no room for you. End of discussion. Margaret's fingers hovered over her phone screen. She could feel the heat of embarrassment rising in her face. Not because she had done anything wrong, but because of how easily people like Deborah could make someone like her feel small. "I'd like a refund, then," Margaret said, forcing her voice to remain even. Deborah shrugged. "That's not my problem. You'll have to take that up with corporate." Margaret took a deep breath, steadying herself. She wasn't about to beg for a room she had already paid for. She wasn't going to let this woman push her out like she didn't belong. She turned her phone toward the security guard, tapping on her email. "Here's my confirmation," she said. "My name is right there. The reservation is paid in full. Do you really think it's right to escort me out when I have every reason to be here?" The guard hesitated. He glanced at the screen, then back at Deborah. A flicker of doubt crossed his face, but it was gone as quickly as it came. Deborah rolled her eyes. "Do you seriously think that proves anything? Emails can be faked. For all I know, you pulled that off the internet." Margaret stared at her, stunned. She had heard a lot of excuses in her lifetime, but this was a new one. Call corporate, then. Margaret said, her patience running thin. "Verify it. You have my name. You have my reservation number." Deborah smirked. "I don't have to do anything." Margaret felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the lobby on her now. Some guests were whispering behind their hands, watching from the plush lounge chairs a few feet away. A younger woman near the elevators had pulled out her phone, possibly recording. Good, Margaret thought. Let them see. She wasn't going to shrink herself down for anyone. She squared her shoulders. "If you refuse to check my reservation and refuse to issue a refund, you're stealing from me." Deborah let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. "Please, you think throwing around accusations will change anything?" Margaret's voice didn't waver. "I think it will when I take this to my lawyer." For the first time, Deborah's smirk faltered, but before she could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "What seems to be the problem here?" A man in a navy blue suit stepped out from a side office, his expression carefully neutral. He was older, mid-50s, with salt and pepper hair and a hotel-issued name tag that read Operations Director. Margaret turned to him, relief washing over her. "Finally," she said, "I've been trying to check in, but your manager refuses to honor my reservation." The director frowned, glancing between her and Deborah. "Miss Lancaster, is that true?" Deborah straightened, her confidence snapping back into place. "There was a clerical error," she said smoothly. "Unfortunately, we're at capacity, and there's nothing I can do." I was just explaining that to her. Margaret exhaled slowly, her patience wearing thin. "There's no clerical error," she said. "I have an email confirmation, and I expect my reservation to be honored." The director rubbed a hand over his chin, looking uncomfortable. "We really are fully booked tonight," he said carefully. "But let me check the system myself." Deborah stiffened, her jaw clenching so tight Margaret could almost hear it. But the moment the director stepped behind the desk, Deborah reached out to stop him. Deborah's hand shot out, landing lightly on the director's arm. It was a small, almost imperceptible motion, but Margaret didn't miss it. Neither did the director. His eyes flicked down to where her fingers rested before he slowly turned his gaze up to her face. "Miss Lancaster," he said, his tone sharp with quiet authority, "step aside." For a split second, something flashed in Deborah's eyes. Panic, hesitation, maybe even anger. But she masked it quickly. "Sir, I've already checked," she said, her voice oozing with manufactured confidence. "There's nothing available." The director didn't reply. Instead, he motioned for Jasmine, the young receptionist, to bring up the reservation log. Margaret stood perfectly still, watching as Jasmine's fingers flew across the keyboard. The tension in the room thickened, stretching between them like a rope pulled tight. "And then there it is," Jasmine murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret exhaled sharply. Vindication. The director leaned in, scanning the screen. His face remained impassive, but Margaret caught the way his brows lifted just slightly. Surprise, maybe concern. "Paid in full," Jasmine added, glancing toward Deborah. Margaret shifted her focus back to the hotel manager, watching as Deborah's face paled just slightly before she covered it with a scoff. Well, that doesn't change the fact that we don't have a room available, Deborah snapped. Jasmine hesitated. The director frowned. Margaret had had enough. I want to speak to the owner, she said, her voice calm but firm. Right now? Deborah let out a sharp, dismissive laugh, shaking her head. You think the owner has time for this? Please. He's not going to waste his evening on. Margaret was already dialing. She held the phone to her ear, her expression unreadable as the line rang once, then twice. On the third ring, a voice picked up. Mom! At the sound of her son's voice, something inside Margaret eased, but only slightly. She wasn't done yet. Christopher, she said, keeping her voice measured, I'm at the Lexington Grand. They're refusing to honor my reservation. A pause. Then what? The word came out sharp, clipped, not at her, but at the situation. They're claiming the hotel is full, Margaret continued, watching Deborah closely, and that there's nothing they can do. Another pause, then a quiet inhale. I'll be there in 10 minutes, Christopher said. Margaret lowered the phone and slid it back into her purse. She didn't say another word. She didn't need to. But Deborah, oblivious to what was coming, rolled her eyes. That's cute, she muttered, folding her arms. Calling your son like he's going to fix this. Margaret simply tilted her head, studying her, and then finally she spoke. You have no idea what you've done, she said softly. Deborah snorted, smirking. Oh, trust me, I know exactly what I'm doing. Margaret just smiled, but before Deborah could say anything else, the glass doors of the hotel slid open once again. The soft whoosh of the glass doors opening barely registered in the tension-thickened air, but Margaret noticed. She didn't turn around immediately. Instead, she kept her gaze fixed on Deborah, watching, waiting. The hotel manager was still smirking, completely unaware of the shift in energy that had just entered the room. Christopher Jenkins didn't walk in with a storm of anger or demand for justice. He didn't need to. His presence alone commanded attention. Dressed in a tailored charcoal gray suit, he moved with quiet authority, his expression unreadable as he scanned the room. No one recognized him, not yet, but Margaret could feel it. The shift. She could see Jasmine's eyes widen slightly when she glanced up from the computer. The security guard who had been standing stiffly by her side suddenly seemed unsure of himself. Even the operations director, the man who had tried to step in earlier, straightened his posture slightly, as if sensing that someone important had just arrived. But Deborah, she didn't have a clue. Instead, she was still talking, rambling even, shaking her head as she glanced toward the door. Margaret had just been asked to leave. I really don't know why you're still here, Deborah scoffed. You think calling your son is going to make me change my mind? Sweetheart, I've been doing this job for 15 years. I know how to handle difficult guests. Christopher stopped in his tracks. Margaret finally turned, and just like that, the room shifted again. Christopher's expression didn't change, but his eyes locked onto Deborah. For the first time since this ordeal began, Margaret saw uncertainty flicker across the woman's face. But still, Deborah hadn't fully grasped what was happening. So she sighed dramatically and waved toward Christopher, without really looking at him. Sir, I'm sorry you had to come all the way here, she said, her voice laced with manufactured politeness. Unfortunately, your mother doesn't have a valid reservation, and I've already explained to her that we're fully booked. If you could just... Who are you? Christopher's voice was calm, but there was something in it, a weight, a precision, that made the room go silent. Deborah blinked, clearly caught off guard. I just told you, I'm the manager. Christopher let her words sit in the air for a moment. Then, finally, he spoke again. And who do you think I am? Deborah let out a short, annoyed laugh. I don't know. Her son, obviously. Christopher's expression didn't change, but something cold and unreadable settled into his gaze. That's right, he said. I am her son. Margaret could feel the tension rippling through the room now. Somewhere near the front desk, Jasmine's fingers had gone still on the keyboard. The operations director had shifted ever so slightly, his eyes darting between Christopher and Deborah like he was putting the pieces together. But Deborah, she still didn't see it. She tilted her head, scoffing. "Look, I get it," she said. "You want to defend your mother. That's sweet. But this is a business, not a family reunion. There's no special treatment here." Christopher's expression remained unreadable. But then, slowly, he pulled his wallet from his suit pocket. He flipped it open, took out a sleek black and gold business card, and placed it flat on the counter in front of her. Margaret watched as Deborah's eyes flicked down to it. Casual at first, and then everything changed. Her face froze. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. Margaret could practically see the blood drain from her face as she processed what she was reading. Christopher let her sit in that moment, let the weight of reality settle over her like a stone pressing on her chest. And then, finally, he spoke again. "My name is Christopher Jenkins," he said, his voice steady, calm, unshaken. "I own this hotel." And just like that, the smirk on Deborah's face vanished. The silence that followed was suffocating. Margaret watched as Deborah's entire demeanor shifted in an instant. The smugness, the confidence, it all drained from her face, as if someone had pulled the ground out from beneath her. She started, but her voice betrayed her. Christopher tilted his head slightly, waiting, not rushing, not helping, just watching. The security guard who had been standing rigidly by Margaret's side just moments ago took a small step back, suddenly looking anywhere but the unfolding scene. Jasmine swallowed hard, her fingers nervously tapping at the edge of the keyboard. Even the operations director, who had been cautiously neutral up until now, shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. But Deborah, she was frozen in place, her fingers twitching slightly as if grasping for a lifeline that didn't exist. I didn't realize," she finally managed, her voice then unsteady. Christopher didn't react. He let her words hang in the air, unanswered, forcing her to fill the silence on her own. I was just following protocol," she continued quickly, her voice tripping over itself. "We have policies, strict ones, about overbookings and guest conflicts and—" Christopher raised a hand, and just like that, she stopped talking. For the first time, a flicker of something dangerous passed through his gaze. "Did you follow protocol?" he asked, his voice measured, cold. Deborah hesitated. Christopher tapped a single finger on the counter, because from what I saw, protocol had nothing to do with this. Deborah's throat bobbed as she swallowed. I thought she was a walk-in," she lied. "We've had issues with—" "Don't," Christopher said, his voice like a knife. Margaret had seen that tone before. Not in boardrooms, not in hotel meetings, but in courtrooms, classrooms, places where power shifted in an instant. Christopher leaned in slightly, resting both hands on the counter. "You had my mother's name," he said, each word slow, deliberate. "You had her reservation in the system. You had proof she paid. And yet you told her she didn't belong here." Deborah's lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Christopher exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head. "Tell me," he continued, his voice lowering, "if she had been someone else, someone you considered the right kind of guest, would she have been treated this way?" Deborah's face twitched, her breath hitching slightly. Margaret could see her mind racing, scrambling for a way out. "Sir, I would never—" "You would," Christopher interrupted smoothly. "You did." Deborah opened her mouth, then snapped it shut again. For the first time since this entire situation began, she understood there was no escaping this. Christopher let out a slow, controlled breath before straightening. His eyes flicked toward the operations director, who had been standing uncomfortably still, watching everything unfold. "Douglas," Christopher said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried through the lobby like a verdict. The man straightened instantly. "Yes, sir." Christopher's expression remained unreadable. "Is this how you run my hotel?" Douglas's face turned pale. "No, sir." Christopher's gaze cut back to Deborah, pinning her in place. "You're done here," he said simply. Deborah flinched, her breath catching. "Wait!" "Hand in your name tag. Security will escort you out." A strangled noise left her throat. Mr. Jenkins, please. I've worked here for years. And in those years, Christopher said smoothly, how many other guests have you treated like this? Deborah froze. Her silence was the only answer he needed. But before she could protest further, security finally moved. And this time, it wasn't toward Margaret. The security guard, the same one who had been prepared to remove Margaret just minutes ago, now stood firmly behind Deborah. The shift was undeniable. She was the one being escorted out now. Her face went red, then pale, then red again, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "This is ridiculous," she hissed under her breath, but there was no fire behind her words anymore, no authority, no control. Margaret watched her carefully, taking in every small movement, every twitch of her fingers, every attempt to hold on to the power that had already slipped through her grasp. She had seen people like Deborah her whole life, people who believed their place in the world was secure, unshakable, until the moment they were forced to see the truth. Christopher waited, watching, his face unreadable. "I will be speaking to HR." Deborah tried again, grasping for anything, any foothold, any last shred of dignity. "This is completely out of line." "No," Christopher cut in, his voice sharp, unwavering. "What's out of line is a manager treating guests like they're beneath her. What's out of line is throwing out a 76-year-old woman who paid for her stay. What's out of line is that you stood here lying, believing there would be no consequences." Deborah's lips pressed into a thin line, her chest rising and falling quickly. For the first time since this started, she had nothing left to say. She turned stiffly, snatching the name tag from her blazer and slamming it onto the counter. The security guard stepped forward, motioning for her to walk. Margaret held her gaze as she passed. Deborah didn't look at her. She couldn't. And then she was gone. The silence that followed was thick. No one moved. It was Jasmine who finally exhaled, her hand still resting on the keyboard. The operations director, Douglas, shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Christopher and Margaret. "Mr. Jenkins." Douglas started carefully. Christopher turned to him, but the sharpness was gone from his face now. He let out a slow breath, shaking his head slightly. "We'll talk later," he said, his voice lower now, steady. "But from now on, I expect every guest to be treated with the respect they paid for." Douglas nodded quickly, looking relieved just to have a way out of the conversation. "Of course, sir. Absolutely." Christopher finally turned back to his mother. Margaret studied him carefully, taking in the tension still lingering in his shoulders, the way his hands hadn't fully relaxed yet. "You okay?" he asked, softer now. Margaret smiled, small but certain. "I am now." Christopher exhaled, then gestured toward the front desk. "Let's get you checked in properly." Jasmine moved fast, clicking through the system, her hands almost shaking as she typed. "I've got a suite ready, Miss Atwood Jenkins," she said quickly. "We'll upgrade you at no extra charge. Of course, I'll also make sure you get free room service for the rest of your stay." Margaret raised a brow, then shot Christopher a look. "I don't need special treatment." He smirked slightly. "It's not special treatment. It's an apology." Margaret sighed but smiled, nodding at Jasmine. "Fine, I'll take it." The young woman looked relieved, sliding a key card across the counter. "Room 1402, ma'am. I'm really sorry about what happened." Margaret accepted the key, but didn't dwell on the apology. The real issue had already been handled. As Christopher walked her toward the elevators, she glanced at him from the side. "You really didn't have to come all the way here," she said, teasing lightly. He scoffed. "You know I did." She chuckled softly, then after a beat, "I'm proud of you, you know." Christopher glanced at her, something softer passing over his face. "I know." The elevator door slid open, and as they stepped inside, Margaret knew one thing for sure. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. As the elevator doors slid shut, Margaret leaned against the cool metal railing, letting the weight of the evening settle. The exhaustion from her travels, the tension of the confrontation. It was all still there, lingering in the background. But now there was something else, something stronger. Relief, resolution, a quiet kind of justice. Christopher stood beside her, hands in his pockets, watching the floor numbers light up one by one. Margaret exhaled slowly. I almost walked out, you know, she said. Christopher turned to her, brows lifting slightly. I didn't want to cause a scene, she admitted. I didn't want to be that person. Christopher frowned. That person? Margaret shrugged, her fingers absently running along the edge of the key card in her hand. The one who argues. The one who has to prove she belongs. Christopher's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger at her, but at what she was saying. You never have to prove you belong, he said, his voice firm, unwavering. Not to people like her. Margaret studied him for a long moment. So much of her fight was in him now, but he had learned to wield it differently. In boardrooms, in negotiations, in moments like this. She smiled, small but certain. You handle that well. Christopher smirked slightly, shaking his head. I almost didn't. She raised a brow. He chuckled under his breath. I was about 5 seconds away from throwing her out myself. Margaret laughed softly. Now, that would have been a scene. The elevator dinged, and the door slid open to the 14th floor. Christopher gestured for her to step out first, and they walked in comfortable silence toward her suite. Jasmine hadn't been exaggerating. The room was stunning. A skyline view, plush bedding, soft golden lighting that made everything feel warm and welcoming. Margaret sighed as she set her purse down. Finally, Christopher lingered by the door, watching her settle in. You sure you're okay? He asked, quieter now. Margaret met his gaze, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she smiled. I've been through worse. Christopher let out a breath of a laugh, shaking his head. I know. A beat of silence stretched between them. Then Margaret spoke again. This isn't just about me, you know? Christopher tilted his head. What do you mean? She gestured vaguely toward the door, toward the world outside the suite. How many others did she turn away? How many people just walked out quietly? Christopher's expression hardened slightly, but not in a way that surprised her. I'll find out, he said simply, and she won't be the last one held accountable. Margaret studied him, then nodded. Good. Christopher checked his watch. I should let you rest. I'll check in tomorrow. Margaret smirked. You're just going to leave without telling me about your latest project? Christopher chuckled. I'll save that for breakfast. She laughed softly, shaking her head. Fine. Breakfast? He gave her one last look, then stepped toward the door. Before he left, he glanced back at her. I'm glad you can just walk out. Margaret's smile deepened. Me too. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Margaret alone in the quiet, luxurious calm of her well-earned room. She sighed, sinking into the armchair by the window, watching the city lights below. Then, slowly, she pulled out her phone. She stared at the screen for a moment, then opened her messages, typing out a simple thought. Never let anyone tell you where you do and don't belong. She hit send, because maybe, just maybe, someone else needed to hear it tonight. Margaret could have left quietly. She could have accepted the mistreatment and walked away. But standing up for yourself, even when it's uncomfortable, even when people try to silence you, matters. Not just for you, but for everyone who comes after you. So if you ever find yourself in a moment where you're being pushed aside, disrespected, or treated unfairly, don't just walk away. Speak up, because you never know who's listening. What do you think? Have you ever experienced something like this? Let's talk about it in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that need to be told.